Hi. All right, guys, welcome back. Thanks for coming back. Anybody go anywhere good for lunch that you want to share? Did you go? Who went to Bone Bar? Raise your hand if you went to Bone Bar. I'm so happy. Was it good? Was it some of the best banh mi you've ever had? It was good, right? Did you guys get the egg on it? No? You can get the egg, it's $1 more. Did anybody have anything negative to say about Bone Bar? They sold out?
So we went to
LNG. LNG is good too. I would say LNG is probably the second best. I think Bone Bar is probably definitely the top best. Did you go to Bone Bar?
They were out of bread.
They were out of bread. That's what they said. Yeah. You think like the one thing when you have sandwiches is like to make sure you have enough bread, right? Yeah. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Sounds good. All right, well, our next topic is going to be presented by Dr. Sarah Firestone. You guys have probably passed her, working with her amongst this big journey that we call life. And Sarah's going to be talking to us today about jurisdiction. I know the time for the jurisdiction says 12:30 to 1. But she's gonna go on a little bit longer because jurisdiction, as you probably know, is probably a very big, complex thing. And then the ESA talk's going to be a little bit lighter. So just FYI, so you're aware of that. But without further ado, Dr. Firestone, to the stage, please.
You can just call me Sarah. You know that. All right. So, I'm going to go over a whole bunch of stuff. I know everyone is really excited about the new definition of waters of the U.S., but the final rule hasn't been posted yet, so we're not actually going to talk about it. We're going to go la, 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 la. Okay? All right. So, we're talking about the 2023 rule as amended. That's the definition of waters of the U.S. under Section 404 that we're going over today. So, the nice thing is that the definition of wetlands has not changed. In none of the changes to the definition of waters of the U.S. has the definition of a wetland or tributary changed. It's just whether that's jurisdictional. So a wetland is still an area that's inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and under normal circumstances does support a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions, which does seem to be a bit of a tautology, but that's what the rule says, or that's what the regulation says. So, similarly, how we delineate wetlands has not changed and is not anticipated to change with the new definition of waters of the U.S. You should be using the 1987 manual, and you should be using the appropriate supplement. In our district, that is the Arid West Supplement or Western Mountains, Valleys, and Coasts. How do you determine which one you're supposed to use? My goal is to keep you guys awake. You just ate lunch. So land resource area helps where you are. So there's a fancy map, but sometimes the difference between Arid West and Western Mountains, Valleys, and Coasts, we can get really close to that border. So at the beginning of each of these supplements, there is a description. So you read the description. And does that match? Which of those supplements best matches the review area you are standing in? So it's going to have to do with elevation, rainfall. Sometimes it has to do with the aspect of the slope. Are you facing the Pacific Ocean versus are you facing the Central Valley? So that is how you determine which one, which might result in you doing your delineation in one region, and then after we've evaluated it, telling you, no, I believe it is more appropriate for you to have been using the other supplement. Not going to happen a lot in, say, the Santa Clara Valley. But Mendocino County, yeah, it's going to happen in Mendocino County. We have automated data sheets. There are automated data sheets for each of the regions. Make sure you're using the correct one. Only use the Arid West one if you're in the Arid West. If you're in Western Mountains, Valleys, and Coast, use the other one. Okay? I find this really useful simply to check my my results when I get back to the office. I understand that there are some issues using these out in the field. Sometimes they quit and then you lose all your data, and that's not fun. That makes everyone very sad. So just know that these are a resource and they'll give you suggestions. So you put in the plant species name and it will tell you what its wetland classification is. You don't have to look it up. You put in your soils data and it will tell you that this one qualifies for redox dark surface and may qualify for redox depressions, depending on whether you're in a depression. Oops, that was the wrong one. That one. There we go. Speaking of whether you're in a depression, see this top area, whether you're using the automated data sheets or the regular data sheets, please fill this whole thing in. Okay, I understand, it's boring, it's a lot of information, and you've got better things to do. There's all this fun stuff, this data that you're collecting, but please do fill this in, because this is very important, especially this, landform, local relief, slope, okay, latitude, longitude, sampling date, sampling point. All of your sampling dates should be clustered together, ideally. If they are not, you're going to need to explain in your delineation report, why did you go out different times, okay? So a lot of times you're going to fill this out and be like, why do I have to fill it out again? Can I just, copy it to each of the new data sheets and then that's less work for me? Well, that is totally fine with project site and maybe sampling date. Big error that I often find is that you forget to adjust the stuff that changes when you go to a different sample point. So the summary of findings, should match the data on the data sheet. But I suspect when it doesn't match the data on the data sheet is probably you copied that data sheet from the last data point. And that makes things very confusing. So double check to ensure the summary of findings matches. Please do use the remarks sections. We love remarks. We love all remarks. Okay? We love drawings of cross-sections of the wetlands. Show us where the data points were. Show us where the break and slope is. In vegetation, please include your plot sizes. And if they're smaller than the plot sizes recommended in the supplement in the 1987 manual, please explain why. Just no plot size, or it's a 3-foot diameter, plot size for herbaceous stratum. That's going to raise questions. Why? It should be 5 feet in diameter, or 5-foot radius. So why is it so small? The recommended excavation depth is 20 inches, unless you've got thick dark surface, in which case it's 24 inches. So please do not dig down only 5 inches and tell me you do not have hydric soils, because I'm going to kick the delineation back to you. Okay, you can dig down only 5 inches and tell me you have, redox, well, this is for Western Mountain Valley and Coast. Redox depressions. You could dig down only 5 inches and tell me you have redox depressions. That's a possibility. But digging down only 5 inches and telling me that you do not have hydric soils, I'm going to question why. Did you hit something that might be a restrictive layer? That might be causing a perched water table, in which case we've got to talk about your definition of hydric soils. All right. Again, use the remarks section. Okay, done with wetlands, streams. We have a national ordinary high water mark delineation manual now. It's got data sheets. If your review area, study area for your delineation has streams in it, please include, please include a data sheet for each of your streams. It's really, really helpful. A lot of you are already including that information. You're just including it in prose format in your report. But it is much easier for us to quickly review the data if you include it in a data sheet. Stream duration assessment method. This is relatively new, and it's really cool. This link on the left, this goes to a bunch of training materials, including videos. The link on the right takes you to the actual stream flow duration assessment. you collect a bunch of data. It'll explain what data you collect. You put it into this web app, which has an algorithm in it based on tons and tons of research by the EPA. And it will generate a report. You save that PDF, you include it in your delineation report. Okay, this is going to help you determine the duration of the stream flow. And in the 2023 rule as amended, that becomes very important because non-relatively permanent waters are no longer jurisdictional. This is how we determine whether something's relatively permanent. So if you have something that is the Guadalupe River, probably don't need to do an SDAM for the Guadalupe River. But if you have something smaller and you're telling us it is intermittent or it's ephemeral or what have you, we would like to see it backed up with an SDAM report. So Kendra already talked about the fact that we have fancy map and drawing standards where we spell out exactly what figures you're supposed to have. There is an entire section just about delineations. So please, look, five different figures that you should have in every delineation report. And these can be done by hand. I know that hand drawing maps is a dying art, but there are still people around who can do perfectly good, well-designed hand-drawn maps, and they submit them to us. There are also people who have really expensive software and send us horrible, horrible maps. So please include all the stuff Kendra talked about, include this. Here is a link to our map and drawing standards. It's on the webpage. And I am not going to read all of these things, but these PowerPoint presentations are going to be available online after this. So I just put this is my wish list. Okay, when you submit a delineation report, I want all of this, please. All right, moving on. Our regulatory guidance letter 1601, Regal 1601. It is your friend. A lot of you already know how to use this. Your request for a JD is Appendix 1 of that Regal, or you just fill out the thing on the RRS, and then you don't have to worry about which form. I have had people sometimes submit Appendix 2 thinking that that's requesting a delineation. It's not. You don't have to worry about which appendix you're supposed to fill out if you do it on the RRS. So you could have, there are some cases where you do not need a JD. And I'll cover which ones. You might need a preliminary JD, that's a PJD. You might need an approved JD, which we refer to as an AJD. And I'll go over some of the differences between those two. So when might you not need a JD? Now, does that mean you don't need a delineation report? No! You always need a delineation report. Okay, unless you're talking about something that's out in the middle of the San Francisco Bay, in which case you can say, hey, we're in the middle of a navigable body of water. We're not going to submit a delineation report because it would just be a big blue square. Okay, so you still need a delineation report. We just don't need to do a JD. So general permits, nationwide permits, regional general permits, PGPs, those do not require a JD. Do they require a delineation? Yes. Okay. Or, oops, back. Okay, generally you need a JD if you're going to get an individual permit. However, if you're in the middle of the San Francisco Bay, and we can all agree that, yeah, it's going to be a big blue square, it's jurisdictional, then you don't need a delineation report. We can all just agree that that's a water of the US. Okay. Similarly, if you're doing something under Guadalupe Slough, we can all just agree Guadalupe Slough is a navigable water. It's subject to the ebb and flow of the tide. All right, you might get away with not doing a delineation report on that one. Okay, so generally, unless either it's a general permit or it's something so obvious that a delineation report is not necessary or that a JD is not necessary, then we're going to need a JD. We always need a delineation report. Okay, I am not going to go over all of these. But here is a comparison, PJDs versus AJDs. In general, a PJD is advisory. Okay, so all it's going to say is, this is what's wet. These are all the potential waters of the US on the site. It is not an official agency action. It is not going to be able to be appealed. On the other hand, and it doesn't have an expiration date. Okay, on the other hand, an AJD requires a lot more work by both you and the project manager at the Corps. And that is an official action by the Corps that an AJD is going to determine which of the wet things on your study area are waters of the US. Now, does it make a difference which of these it is as far as whether a wetland is going to show up on the map? No. Whether it's jurisdictional or not, it's going to be on that map. So some people have applied for an AJD thinking that that means all of the non-jurisdictional things are just not going to be on the map. They're going to be on the map, they're just going to be labeled as not waters of the US. So all of the wetlands going to be on the map. And they're all posted on the web for your reading enjoyment. And they also have an expiration date. So it's generally 5 years unless you're within the Santa Rosa Plain or diked baylands, in which case it's 3 years. So no permit required. We've covered some of this before. So when is no permit required? So remember the activity is not regulated, then no permit required and you do not need an AJD. Because the activity itself, we're not worried about whether there are waters of the US on the site, because the activity itself is not regulated. Okay, what if the activity is regulated, so it's a discharge of dredge or fill material, but it's entirely dry land, not a drop of water to be seen? That actually does require an AJD. So it might not make intuitive sense, but that is the guidance and regulations we have. To say that there is no water on a site, that is an AJD. That is the only option you have. We cannot do a PJD of dry land only. That's called a dry land only AJD. Okay, what if, okay, so it might be a regulated activity and there's wet stuff in the project area, but you're not going to be doing the regulated activity in the wet stuff. Okay, you don't need an AJD, but you will need a PJD. So you will need a delineation. You need a PJD where we agree what the boundaries of the wet stuff is, and we agree that the regulated activity is not happening in the wet stuff. Okay, so that you've got a regulated activity, but the aquatic resource is not a water of the US. That means you're doing a regulated activity in the wet stuff, but it's not a water of the US. That is definitely an AJD. And then we've got the exempt ones. So the exempt is where you can get that automatic no permit required letter from the RRS because the activity is an exempt activity. Keep in mind that pretty much all of this, as far as no permit required, is going to apply to Section 404 only waters, because when it comes to tidal or navigable waters, Section 10, we regulate almost everything. So the odds that you are not going to need a permit, if it's Section 10, very small. All right, great news about Section 10. Speaking of Section 10, any changes to the definition of waters of the US that has been happening? It's all regarding the definition of waters of the US under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. None of these changes has affected Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, and the proposed rule does not affect Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. So Carquinez Strait's still ours. All right, Just for a quick review, Section 10 goes all the way to the line of mean high water or ordinary high water, and then it goes out 3 miles unless we're talking about a few things, in which case it goes all the way to the outer continental shelf. So if you have been hired for permitting for an evil mastermind headquarters and you're within 3 miles of mean high water, then you are likely going to need a permit. However, if evil mastermind is okay with it being beyond 3 miles, you only need a permit if we're talking about an artificial island or something else affixed to the seafloor. Floating evil mastermind headquarters will not require a permit if they're more than 3 miles from mean high water. All right, Section 404, riveting. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through the various categories. Again, this is the 2023 rule as amended. Okay, so it's not the brand new one that's coming out, the 2025 rule. All right, so one thing the amendment changed was interstate wetlands. So those are no longer a category A1, but generally A1, that's not changed a lot in all of the various iterations of the definition of waters of the US. If it's subject to the ebb and flow of the tide, if it's traditionally navigable, it's jurisdictional. Impoundments, and I understand I didn't pick this picture. That's not an impoundment, that looks like Oakland Harbor. If it was a water of the US and you put a dam in front of it, it's still a water of the US. So that hasn't changed. Tributaries, now we've got this whole relatively permanent thing. How do we determine if something's relatively permanent? SDAM. Okay. Now, lakes and ponds under this current definition would qualify as tributaries. It's kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but many lakes and ponds are A3. So let's talk tributaries and what does or does not sever jurisdiction. Okay, if it was permanent, it had permanent flow, and then people started taking water out of it and now it does not have permanent flow, it's still jurisdictional. Okay, if it has, oops, back, I keep hitting that button instead of the laser. If it goes through a reach that's not jurisdictional, it goes through a culvert, it goes through a gravel area where it doesn't have relatively permanent flow above ground, that reach is not jurisdictional, but it does not sever upstream jurisdiction. So you can have non-jurisdictional reaches that do not sever upstream jurisdiction of a tributary. We're not talking adjacent wetlands here, we're talking tributaries. Okay, but that statement that it can go through a pipe, that's like a pipe that is a single pipe, it's a culvert. Once you go into something like a stormwater system, where you have laterals attached to that pipe, that severs jurisdiction. Okay, so if you have a stream, it goes into the Santa Rosa stormwater system, which all discharges into the Laguna de Santa Rosa, that severs jurisdiction. That's a stormwater system with laterals. So anything that feeds into the Santa Rosa stormwater system is not jurisdictional. It's not considered a jurisdictional tributary. Do you still need a state permit for it? Yes. Okay, I'm not saying anything about waters of the state. So, a wetland reach, so let's say it goes, you've got a tributary that flows into a flat area and it becomes a marshland, and then it travels further and it becomes a tributary again. Generally, that marshland is going to be considered an abutting wetland, and if the flow through it is relatively permanent, which you can document using SDAM, then the upstream part of the tributary, the upstream reaches, are still jurisdictional. Now we're not talking, that was tributaries. That was, does the upstream reach of a tributary maintain jurisdiction as it's going out to the ocean or the bay? That's not talking about adjacent wetlands. What does a wetland need to be if it's going to be adjacent now?
A continuous surface connection.
There have been many definitions of a continuous surface connection. Okay, it's got to be touching, it's got to be abutting now. So no significant nexus, no, the wetland boundary has to be touching or overlapping the ordinary high water mark. Now, here's my relatively permanent tributary. We've got a cross section here. We've got a culvert under a road, and we've got a wetland. If at ordinary high water, the culvert is low enough that ordinary high water line goes through the culvert. So at ordinary high water, water's going to come up from this tributary and touch the border of that wetland. That wetland is still adjacent. Okay, that wetland is jurisdictional. On the other hand, if you have a wetland, and let's say the ordinary high water mark is down here, okay, so ordinary high water, the water does not go into the culvert at ordinary high water. In that case, the wetland would not be jurisdictional. A5, we generally don't use. So generally, if something qualifies for A5, generally it also qualifies for A1 through A4, and we preferentially use those. All right. Yeah, I finished that pretty fast. Okay, questions? I'm sorry, Jen, I put them all to sleep. Question, you need to talk to the microphone so we'll record the question.
Can you just clarify why you don't use the A5?
Generally, it's simply because anything that's been submitted to us that would qualify as A5 qualifies for one of the others, and our instructions are you want to use the smallest number. So if something could qualify as either an A3 or an A2, then we generally prefer to call it an A2. If something could qualify as an A3 or an A1, we prefer to use A1. And so our district doesn't tend to use A5 because anything that we've received that could qualify as an A5 also qualifies as an A1 through A4. State Water Board, right?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes, this is more of a comment. I just wanted to give everybody a reminder that the Port of Cologne Act still does exist and it's probably not going anywhere. So under the Port of Cologne Act, any water, any feature that used to be a water of the U.S. is still technically a water of the states. So please reach out to the water boards just in case if it's determined that a project does not have any federal jurisdiction features, it might still need a waste discharge requirement from the water boards. Thank you.
Yep, I totally agree with that. We are different regulations. Yeah.
Kind of leads into one of my questions. I have two. First of all, you talked about the no permit required.
Mm-hmm.
Are people supposed to apply for that always if they're using an exemption, or is it recommended or is it required to document that there was no permit needed?
So you're saying you have a project that qualifies for an exemption. Generally, I would recommend, and you're saying you don't talk to the Corps, but you're going to get your water board permit and your BCDC permit and that sort of thing. It is in your best interest to document that it qualifies for this exemption. And I would say that your best way of documenting it is either getting one of those letters from the RRS or at least having a pre-application meeting with the Corps,
Okay.
where you've talked to us and someone has agreed with you, yes, this appears to qualify for the exemption. You don't necessarily need to submit a permit application, but check with us just to get some verification. Yes, that appears to qualify for the exemption.
Okay. And then second question is, if you're on federal land or under a federal easement, land that's on a federal easement, and you think an exemption applies, or an exemption does apply, is a 401 consultation still required in that setting? Which might be a water board question.
I think that would be a water board question. I think it depends on the type of federal land.
Okay.
I know that, let's see, if it's section 401, you may still need a permit. If it's Port or Cologne, you may not on federal land, but that is a question for the water board.
Okay. Thank you.
More questions?
Hello, Katie Gallagher with H.D. Harvey and Associates. So I have a project where the Army Corps staffer on the project decided that there is no more Corps jurisdiction in the project area, but there is State Water Board jurisdiction, and so we're getting a WDR. But the instruction from the Corps staffer, PM, was to withdraw the request. But it looked like in your table that in that situation, we should have still requested an AJD. Can you talk about that?
So that
conflict?
it depends on whether you need that official notice, no permit required letter.
Okay.
So if you're fine with just withdrawing it, then you can withdraw it. But sometimes the state water board or the county requires you to show them something that is, how do you know you don't need a core permit?
Right.
In which case you need a no permit required letter. And if you want the fancy letter with the letterhead, you're going to have a JD.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions for Dr. Sarah? Or just Sarah? For Dr.
So in the past, we have secured aquatic resources verifications. Could you explain, like, I'm not exactly sure what that is, but could you talk about that? And then also my other question is, when you have a PJD, and I think the aquatic resources verification as well, you're mapping like all of the wetlands. So the Corps just treats everything, like any impacts within any of those aquatic resources to be impacts under the 404 permit or section 10.
Okay, couple questions there. Let me make sure I get them right. So what was the first one?
Could you just talk a little bit about aquatic resource verifications and
Ah,
where they
that one.
fall within PJDs and AJDs, and like kind of like how are they similar and different?
So-
I'm just looking for a little bit of clarification.
Certainly. So in order for a district to be able to do an aquatic resource verification, they need to, there needs to at least be a public notice. It is, this is how we're going to do aquatic resource verifications in this district. The San Francisco district has no protocol for aquatic resource verification. So Sacramento district does. So if you've gotten an aquatic resource verification, like an actual letter, then it was either from a brand new project manager that didn't know that they weren't supposed to do it in the San Francisco district, or you got it from Sacramento district, because we're not supposed to be doing aquatic resource verifications in the San Francisco district because we have not established that protocol yet. I'm not sure if we will.
It was in SAC district.
It was in the SAC district. That makes me feel so much better. Okay. Okay, and then the second question was about PJDs?
So for PJDs, if you're just mapping everything, I think I know the answer to this, but the Corps is just permitting all impacts to your mapped wetlands
Right.
and waters.
So our guidance right now is that if we get a PJD map and there are obviously isolated waters, we cannot issue a PJD for obviously isolated waters. It has to be an AJD which will say that they are isolated, they're not jurisdictional. Now you can divide the project area into regions of an AJD and regions of a PJD. So let's say you have a large project area, you've got a bunch of isolated wetlands over on one side, and then you have a river, and you've got adjacent wetlands along the river. We can issue a PJD for the river and the adjacent wetlands, the wetlands that are not even touching the river, that are all isolated, we would have to do an AJD over that part. And that's the instructions we've been given from headquarters. And so in that case, so if it can reasonably be argued that the aquatic resources could be jurisdictional. So you've got wetlands, they're adjacent to a tributary. We don't have to necessarily track the tributary all the way to the ocean in order to show that those wetlands are jurisdictional. We can issue a PJD for that site. But if you have something where simply looking at the site map, you can tell that those things are isolated, we have to issue an AJD for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question kind of related to that. So what you're saying is, if I submit a PJD for, say, a creek, and the creek goes into a storm drain system, obviously it goes into a storm drain system, you will not issue a PJ to me? You'll have to do an approved JD?
That is going to be a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
But we do have guidance that in some cases, when someone requests a PJD, we have to issue an AJD.
Okay.
In some
So
situations.
it's case by case.
It's case by case. All right. Okay.
Any other questions for Sarah? No, we're actually, yeah, if you have a question, because I'm next and I'm super fast, so yeah, you can ask another question.
I don't know if I have a question, but you showed a chart up. Whoa, hello. You showed a chart up there that, from my interpretation, I read if you're putting fill into an upland with no aquatic features, you need an AJD.
So that if you want the fancy letter that says no permit required.
Okay,
And that
only
was
if you want that.
another question. So this is, is an AJD required to get a no permit required letter? And in that situation, we're talking about the one with the fancy letterhead.
Okay, I see. That's the
Yeah.
part that I missed on.
Yeah.
I thought you were saying it would break the law if we did that.
No.
Okay.
So
'Cause
it
that's
is.
going to bust everybody's
So
minds
generally,
here, but, okay.
what is going to happen, what you're trying to protect yourself against is you get your neighbor angry, and
Who, me?
you would be surprised how many of our compliance checks are because someone got their neighbor angry. So someone calls in and says, so-and-so on this property is working without a core permit, at which point we need to go out and we ask you, we say, hey, looks like you're doing some work here. So, did you get a permit? And at that point, you need to be able to show us, look, we did a delineation, and our delineation is like all the stuff's over there, or the delineation found no aquatic resources whatsoever. In which case, hopefully what happens is we read the delineation report and we say, yes, this is a lovely delineation report. I totally agree with everything it says. You're good to go. We close the inquiry. So it's basically, you need to be able to show us that you have done due diligence in determining whether you needed a core permit, just in case we come to you asking, have you done your due diligence? But this is just, do you need the fancy no permit required letter?
Yeah, and that's a very plausible situation you described there. So thank you very much. I understand.
It's almost like
Thank
it's
you.
happened before.
Any other
Right.
questions?